Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. We are glad to have everybody with us. Folks still continue to come in. My name is Drew Gardner with the two Mississippi Museums, and we want to welcome you to this week's History is Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Neal Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We're also streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where any of our previous History is Lunch programs are available to watch at any time. We hope that you will consider joining us this Sunday for Sunday screening, Lynching in History and Memory at 2 p.m. here September 7th in the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium. This program will feature 3 short films, My Father's Name, Boot Jack in Red, and Sights of Memory that explore the history of racial violence in our state and the work of remembrance. Next week's History is Lunch, we are excited to welcome our friends from Gulf Coast Vietnamese Narratives as we explore the legacy of refuge and resilience along Mississippi's Gulf Coast. But today we are extremely excited to welcome a star cast for our panel today, remembering the Clinton Massacre 150 years later. We're excited to welcome Missy Jones, DeeDee Baldwin, Albert Dorsey, and Nicholas Lemann. So let's give them a round of applause as they make their way to the stage. As they make their way up, I want to tell you a little bit about each of these individuals. Missy Jones is the research historian for the Colorado Black Equity Study. She received her PhD from the University of Southern Mississippi, where she completed her dissertation, The Clinton Massacre of 1875, Dueling Histories and Reconstruction Memory in the Deep South. DeeDee Baldwin is the associate professor and engagement librarian at Mississippi State University, where she has worked since 2007. She is the current president of the Society of Mississippi Archivists, which was was recognized with an award of merit by the Mississippi Historical Society earlier this year for her research against all odds, the first black legislators in Mississippi. Albert Dorsey Jr. earned his PhD from Florida State University in 2012. He currently serves as a history professor at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi, after having spent several years just down the road at Jackson State University. He is also the author of a forthcoming book, The Vicksburg Massacre, The Complexities and Consequences of Black Participation in the Body Politic and Land Ownership in the Age of Redeemer Violence. And then our final guest, Mr. Nicholas Lemann, is a journalist, author, and educator born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, a Harvard graduate and former president of the Harvard Crimson. Lemann currently serves as the Joseph Pulitzer II and Edith Pulitzer Moore Professor of Journalism at Columbia University. Lemann is the author of several acclaimed books, including Redemption, The Last Battle of the Civil War. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. So as we get started with our panel, we'll hop right into it. And Al, I'm going to start with you to kind of think about that first time you kind of came across this story of the Clinton Massacre and kind of what impacts did it have on your research, on your scholarship today. Give a kind of a quick 2-minute answer.
Well, I actually read my colleague's work when I was actually working on my master's thesis actually at Florida State University. I was examining a lynching that occurred in the city, in Vicksburg. And so I had never heard about it before and born and grew up in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So I had never heard about these events and became really, really interested in it and started doing a little more digging in the archives and, discovered that there was a massacre in Vicksburg that actually had preceded the Clinton Massacre, and there was a connection to it. And then, of course, I discovered Professor Lemann's work when I was actually doing my dissertation. So it had a huge impact on my research.
We'll just go right down the line. Missy?
So my discovery actually came through Northside Baptist Church. Some of my fellow church members are here in the audience, but from a church member, Ricky Nations told me about a missing marker. and sort of some controversy around that missing marker, and the pole was still there, but the plaque was gone, and that sparked my interest just as I was beginning my master's work back at Mississippi College. So that was the door that sort of opened that entry point into both history and memory, and why we choose to remember what we remember in parts of history. So that began about 15 years ago.
DeeDee?
I had never heard of the Clinton Massacre until just, I guess, several years ago. Around 2019 or 2020, I started researching the first Black legislators in Mississippi for my research project, and I kept, running into references to this massacre, and that's where I learned about it. And I didn't start seriously looking into it until a couple of years after that. In fact, I think the first time that I spoke at History is Lunch talking about my website, it was during quarantine, and there were like 2 people in this room. So I was up here talking to 2 people. And I didn't know I think I didn't know the exact date even. I was like, I think I said 1874 or 1875. I wasn't even clear on the date at that point. So that's how little I knew about it going into it.
Same question.
Same question, sir.
Okay. So this is going many years back into, I guess, now 40 years ago. I was working on a book that came out in 1991 called The Promised Land, which is about Black migration. Primarily, I was writing about Delta to Chicago. So I'd go to all these towns in the Delta, and as we see here, Mississippians love history. So it seemed like every little town had a local history room in the library. And I'd go to the local history room to read up on the history of the town. Now remember, these history rooms would have been set up in the 19-teens and 20s. So they're primarily telling the story of the wonderful redemption of Mississippi. And in particular, they would always have a story about something they called the Negro Uprising, or the Negro Riot. And it was a story about, a group of white Confederate veterans who had heard that there was a Negro militia having an uprising somewhere out of sight, and they took arms and repulsed them. And what struck me was these took place in like many little towns in Mississippi where I was, and they always had the same exact plot line. They always took place in the same time frame, mid-1870s, and they always had this weird, illogical outcome of the white people were wildly outnumbered, yet they always won. So then you started to think, well, was this really what they said it was? And that sort of unlocked a whole series of stories, including what happened in Clinton, which I'll get into later.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about the first time I was telling Missy this is I'm a K-12 teacher by trade, and that was your Mississippi History Now article, which has some great lesson plans for any educators out there to go back and use to teach this in their classroom. But as we kind of continue and kind of build a sense of the context as we arrive in the fall of 1875, Al, I'm going to kind of swing back over to you. You've done a lot of research into Vicksburg and Peter Crosby and the book coming out. Tell us a sense of Mississippi in kind of that decade plus following emancipation leading up into 1875, and what's going on in Mississippi at the time.
So the most important thing that often gets overlooked by many scholars is the Emancipation Proclamation in context of Vicksburg, Mississippi. So the siege, 1863. The Emancipation, January 1st, 1863. So with that document, Black people making their way to freedom. If they can make their way to freedom, they can make their way to Union lines, they're going to be free because of the Emancipation Proclamation. So when Grant, conquers Vicksburg, July 4th, 1863, guess what? Black people in West Central Mississippi are free if they can make it then. So you have, even before that date, when he comes into the Mississippi Valley region, people are escaping plantations. Black folks are escaping plantations. So that sets the context. July 4th is a critically important day because that's their day of Jubilee. And so when Grant leaves, he leaves in place some Union officers, and Black people are in this sort of quasi-freedom phase where they're absolutely no longer enslaved, but they actually work for the federal government, right? They're planting cotton and doing all the other things, and a lot of that money is benefiting the Union cause. And so that's the context. A lot of Confederates have left their homes, they've abandoned their homes, and Blacks are acquiring land. And so that sets the pattern. That's a precedent that carries on 2 years before the end of the Civil War. So that's sort of the context that leads into the late the 1860s and the early 1870s. Local Black people are acquiring small plots of land. Much of that land has been abandoned, and the taxes haven't been paid. And so Black people, and particularly veterans, they can buy some of that land for a song. They can buy it for the unpaid taxes. And that brings on the ire of a lot of whites.
DeeDee, I'm going to kind of hop over to you a little bit because you've done a ton of work on these Black elected officials that are elected during Reconstruction. Tell us a little bit. Obviously, we know that this is kind of made way by the 1868 Constitution here in Mississippi. Kind of give us a sense and significance of this rising, this growth of Black political power after that Constitution and those early elected officials.
It was really this amazing period in Mississippi, and we were talking earlier about how this should be a point of pride for Mississippi. In 1870, you had the first Black men come into office in the state legislature. Mississippi sent the first 2 African-American men to the Senate. John R. Lynch we had in the House of Representatives. At the height of Reconstruction in Mississippi in 1874, just about half of the legislature was Black men, and that was the highest number of African-American legislators in any state here in Mississippi. And they passed a civil rights law, an anti-segregation law in 1873. So Mississippi for a couple of years was this really revolutionary place, and then the nation really allowed it to be torn down.
Al, one of those Black elected officials was Peter Crosby. You've done a lot of work around Peter Crosby. Tell us just a little bit of kind of beginning to end of Peter Crosby's story and what happens in Warren County in 1874.
So first of all, Peter Crosby he's enslaved on a plantation. I can't remember the name of the county, but it's just south of Meridian. So he's enslaved. He and actually 2 of his brothers are enslaved. They escape. They come to Vicksburg, and then they enlist in the Union Army. So for a couple of years, he's in the Union Army, and he remains, after the war is over, he remains in Vicksburg. And then in 1873, he's elected as the first and only Black sheriff in Warren County. Vicksburg has 70% Black majority, and so he's easily elected. But there's a lot of vitriol because not only is he serving as sheriff, the sheriff's double responsibility is tax collector. Now, Blacks are acquiring some land, but it's a minority it's a small percentage of land. It's about 10%, 10 to 11%, right, depending on how you count the numbers. And so whites who control most of the land, they're very angry about him not only being sheriff, a gun-toting sheriff, but also collecting those taxes. So,
go ahead and follow up and tell us, what happens in that kind of response to Crosby's position.
Sure. So the sheriff has to have a bond, and that bond has to be supported by wealthy either politicians or businessmen, mostly businessmen. And so they bring into question the validity of Crosby's bond. That's the way that they're going to attack him, right? In order to get him out of office, because they do not want him in office. And so after a lot of finagling and going back and forth, they discredit his bond. He comes up with a new bond, and a lot of the signatories on his bond are African American. Okay, they're black businessmen, and they're very wealthy. So the bond is probably valid, but again, they're going to find any way that they can to discredit him. And so once they do that, they come into his office in the downtown courthouse. It's the old county courthouse in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And they threaten him with the lynching. They're like, if you don't resign, bad things are going to happen to you. And he resists at first, but then he comes to his senses and he says, okay, I will leave. He goes to get another one of his former Army buddies, a man by the name of Andrew Owens, who is also, there are a lot of veterans. There are a lot of Civil War veterans that are involved in this thing. And so they go to, Jackson, they meet with the governor, the lieutenant governor, they come back, the governor sends word, form a militia if you can. The problem is they don't have a lot of guns because there hasn't been a lot of support. And so they eventually force Peter Crosby out of his office. They throw him in jail. He stays there for a couple of weeks. They arrest a lot of men, and then they go through the countryside just slaughtering innocent, unarmed people, okay? Black men, young boys, they would come into their house, teenagers, 14, 15, 16 years old. They would force them out of the house. They would shoot them point blank range. They would tell them to run. The young men would run. They would shoot them in the back. And so this carried on for a couple of 3 weeks until the end. This is December 7th, 1874. And so it continues until the end of the year, around Christmas time. Okay. And so that is going to continue. The government comes in, they send in members of House of Representatives, they have an inquiry, you have blacks, you have whites testifying. That's the primary sources, the main primary sources that we have all used. But that continues on into 1875. There's a lot of, Grant tries to order some guns that come in from Greenville, Mississippi. They come down on a steamboat. Those guns are stolen. Those guns are distributed to local whites, but also not only to local Vicksburgers, they're distributed to a lot of White League members in Hinds County as well. And that's the connection, because the terrorism continued throughout the spring and the summer. They're literally going into apartments in Vicksburg and they're burning people alive, black men and black boys. They're burning them alive. And so this continues on into the summer. There is a celebration, and there had always been celebrations of July 4th, right? So when we think about Juneteenth, 1865 is not Juneteenth for West Central Mississippi. It's July 4th. That's a critical date, and it's critically important, I think. So blacks celebrate July 4th. How do you think white Vicksburgers felt about July 4th? Didn't like it so much. And in fact, most whites did not celebrate that day until World War II, D-Day during World War II. They just refused to celebrate it because it was, it was the day that they had to capitulate and had to give up, their thing. And so on July 4th, or actually, let me back up before July 4th. In early June, I think June 11th, Peter Crosby, the sheriff, he goes into a bar. He's already had an argument with his deputy sheriff, and he fires him. And so Peter Crosby goes into a bar on Cherry Street in Vicksburg, and he's standing there at the bar, and then somebody comes through the front door, and a gunshot goes off, and Peter Crosby gets struck in the jaw, and the bullet goes all the way through his face and lodges in the back of his skull. He falls down. He's attended to by a local white doctor there in the bar. Surprisingly, he doesn't die, right? He survives the bullet wound, but he will carry this bullet in the back of his skull, for the rest of his life. He eventually dies in 1884, I think. So now he's somewhat incapacitated, right? And so now there's a good reason to put in, a temporary sheriff. And so by the time we get to July 4th, there's another massacre, and it's a massacre at the courthouse. And so innocent, unarmed, in this celebration, innocent, unarmed blacks are being fired upon. Interestingly, on the 1874 massacre, there had been a lot of vigilantes coming in from outside of the state. And Professor Lemann knows that he writes about this in his text as well. There had been an 1873 Colfax massacre in Louisiana. Some of those people come in, some people come in from as far as southern Illinois. And so that pattern with the guns being stolen in early 1875, there's cannon fire. There are many, there are groups large, they call themselves the Modocs. And interestingly, Modoc is, that's a Native American community. They call themselves Grangers. Grangers are farmers, right? And so they're putting together these large, well-armed militias, and a lot of the guns are stolen guns, and they are patrolling the countrysides as far as Raymond and Hinds County, and that's the connection to the Clinton Massacre.
Well, that brings me right over to you, Nicholas. I was just going to ask, you open Redemption talking about what happens in Colfax. What's happening in Mississippi is happening across the South. Can you kind of give us a broader sense of how white Southerners are responding to Black political power as represented in Peter Crosby?
Yeah, so I want to say, I believe that the Clinton Massacre is a pivotal event in American history, not just history of West Central Mississippi or Mississippi. So you need a little bit of big picture here to understand why. Number one, some of this I'll be sort of preaching to the choir because people where I live now don't get any of it, you guys do. But one, the Civil War, the Union did not enter the Civil War in order to abolish slavery. It's hard to recreate the thought process of why people were willing to lay down their lives in big numbers, but that wasn't why most of them, unfortunately, were laying down their lives. That's why the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't put out until a couple years into the Civil War, because the whole question of the future of slavery hadn't been resolved, at least in the South. Did anybody here see the movie Lincoln, the Steven Spielberg movie? It's highly recommended, but it's another thing just to think about. So it's 1865, the war is almost over. US Congress has no Southerners in it because the Confederacy is still the Confederacy, right? And Lincoln, that movie shows him using all of his great political skill to get the House of Representatives to approve the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery. So, in other words, it wasn't a no-brainer to Northern politicians in the spring of 1875 that slavery should just be abolished in the United States, full stop. And there was slavery outside the South as well. So the whole question of the status of 4 million formerly enslaved Black people in the South after the Civil War was unsettled. And the Civil War did not settle that question. That's really important. And Reconstruction was about settling that question. And basically, the short answer, what happened was there's 3 post-war amendments: 13th, no slavery; 14th, civil rights; 15th, voting rights. The 13th kind of stuck. The 14th and 15th were nullified. And they were nullified through basically organized militia violence that triumphed in the end. That's what happened in Mississippi in 1874, 1875. So what I referred to earlier as Negro uprisings in the minds of whites, these were basically another name for the Republican Party as it was then in Mississippi. Remember, the parties are flipped. The Republican Party then is the Black Party. The Democratic Party then is the white party. Another thing that I think clouds people's minds in understanding this history is there's been a lot of attention lately paid to, Ku Klux Klan and lynchings. And in a way that's misleading because, there were a whole lot of these terrorist, white terror organizations that were essentially political. The Ku Klux Klan was one, but only one. And there were a lot of others, White League, White Line, Grangers, all those things. And they were, I think, coordinating their activities with the more respectable Democratic Party. There's some debate about that. So the key is the only way to enforce voting rights, the 15th Amendment in Mississippi, increasingly was through the presence of federal troops. Federal troops could ensure that voting took place, fairly. And these militia organizations were mostly oriented toward preventing black political activity, black voting, black office holding. They weren't just like random, if you will, acts of terror, which is how we think of lynchings. They had a goal. And so then the question became, would President U.S. Grant, who had his greatest political victory was in Vicksburg, Mississippi, not that far in the past, send federal troops to enforce the 15th Amendment? And he wavered. That's the whole story. Sometimes he did and sometimes he didn't. And the reason is not that he was opposed to Reconstruction, but within the Northern Republican Party, he was probably the most pro-Reconstruction. And the rest of the country, sadly, including a lot of the former abolitionists, had kind of lost patience with their cause, wanted to kind of close the book and get on with it. So Clinton was the real test of, one of these incidents took place. Governor Adelbert Ames sent one of his urgent requests to Washington to please send troops. And then President Grant didn't send troops. And I don't want to go too far into the story, but this really determined what the end of Reconstruction would be, and that the Jim Crow era would happen, in my opinion. So it's an incredibly important event, even though it was local in one place.
Missy, we've kind of heard a little bit about these tax leagues, whiteliners. We've kind of built this structure to kind of understanding that this is an organized attack on black political power. We see a lot of that first starting to be kind of laid out, at least in the public, through the Hinds County Gazette and George W. Harper, as he lays out that plan that we know today now is the first Mississippi plan. Can you tell us what is the first Mississippi plan and why is it significant?
So it first begins, and this is sort of the misnomer about the whole name of the Clinton riot, right? It's not a riot. That moniker that's given to that event is given with the intention to make it seem as though that it just is sparked, that it's a racial tension, that the violence happens because of ongoing racial strife, that comes out of nowhere, but that is precisely not what happens. This was predicated upon white democratic plans and designs that was largely designed after the events in Vicksburg. The Democratic Party went back sort of to the drawing board and thought that we can't sort of fight this fight without having political control. And the events over the summer, they put James E. George in control of taking back political control of the state, and he's in charge. And they have several meetings in Raymond over that summer, and they basically have a plan that any time that the Republican Party meets, that they are going to send men, the whiteliners, to these meetings to break them up, that if any Republican gets on the stand, that they're going to heckle him, that they're going to call him a liar, that they're going to basically get him to quit the stand, to get down off the platform and make him quit speaking. And that's exactly what happens. It happens in Yazoo, it happens in Clinton for sure, and the violence that erupts in Clinton is not a riot, it's by design. There are men who are sent there. You can find in the Raymond Gazette these basically marching orders to whiteliners to go to this event armed and to heckle the speakers on the stand. And that's exactly what happens that day. So it's not, it's by design and by intention.
Yeah, William Calvin Wells who was present. He'll double down on it. And the Mississippi Historical Society's publication in 1906, as he talks about, he titles it "The Reconstruction, Its Destruction in Hinds County," and will lay it all back out for us and then justify it for why it happens. Well, let's hop into September 4th, 1875. Missy, you just done your dissertation on this very subject. You've written about it for the Mississippi Encyclopedia, Mississippi History Now that I referenced earlier. Give us a walkthrough of the events. What is happening that day? You've kind of given us some broad strokes, but kind of give us some finer points of what's happening that Saturday.
So basically, there's a Republican rally and a picnic, a barbecue plan. There's families that come out. If you read the white Democratic reports, they make it sound as though it's all black men and they're in parades and they're marching and they're armed. That is not it. That's not what's happening. It's black families and they're coming out to basically embrace citizenship and to continue this act of becoming more and more aware of what the act of citizenship is, to become more informed as voters. They do parade in the same form and fashion as many of the whiteliners do, and was kind of the act of the day to parade in sort of the GAR or some of the political leagues did at the time, and so they came in fashion and in parade from places like Edwards and Bolton and Vicksburg, and they came to a place called Moses Hill or Moss Hill, which was an old plantation site that had been destroyed during 1863 in part of the march to Vicksburg by Grant. And that day, there were probably, the numbers range from 1,000 to 2,000 African Americans, but they were there to picnic and to participate in citizenship, not to be destructive or to be, they were there with their families. There were women there, there were children there, whole families there to participate and to picnic and to hear the speaker. There was going to be a white Democratic speaker first, and then the Republican speaker. And when the Republican speaker got on the stand, there was a handful of whiteliners there from Raymond who heckled the speaker, and that's when things sort of got out of hand, and the shooting started from the group from Raymond.
And now we see kind of similar situation to what you describe in Vicksburg kind of transpires in Clinton, where this is not a one-day event, but this is violence that's going to happen over a significant period of time and involve a number of people. Nicholas, your book Redemption provides such an interesting perspective into Governor Ames and the situation that he's in as this is happening, and not just happening, as it's happened already. Talk to us a little bit about kind of that government response to this violence that's gonna happen, or lack thereof.
Okay, so I got into this a little before, but just to be more precise about it. So Governor Ames was a former Union general, considered a sort of brilliant young man with a bright political future, and had been the military governor of Mississippi and then became the elected governor of Mississippi. He was white from Maine and presided over the Mississippi Republican Party, which was, very multiracial. So the setup basically was what I said a few minutes ago. He needed the presence of federal troops to ensure free and fair elections because they were being disrupted by the the campaign that we've been talking about. And he would write to President Grant, and President Grant would sometimes say yes, and sometimes say no, and sometimes say yes too late, etc. One of the things I dug up when working on the book was that Grant's cabinet was more anti-Reconstruction than he was. And so instructions came to Ames through his cabinet that were essentially inaccurate because they made it sound like Grant was ordering him not to respond. So this is how it gets set up. If federal troops are sent by the President of the United States, the election can happen freely and fairly, and in that atmosphere, the Republican Party would win. If that doesn't happen, then these terror campaigns will happen, and they'll suppress the black vote, and the Democrats will win. In this instance, what Grant said, or what his staff and advisors made it sound like he had said, was, I don't want to send federal troops. Raise your own militia. So that is really problematic because in the atmosphere of the time, no whites would serve in a state militia to ensure black votes. A black militia would inflame, as it did, the imagination of white Mississippi and cause, tremendous violence, even more than there already was. So the key really was whether President Grant would send federal troops, and in this case, he didn't. And there was I don't want to get into it because it's too complicated for a short panel, but a really dramatic series of events over those days where, the Clinton riot had happened, black people were fleeing where they were because there was a kind of rampage through the countryside by these militias. They would come to Jackson and sort of encamp here for safety, right in this neighborhood, actually. Ames was hearing all these reports from them. He was begging the White House to use federal troops. Remember, the end of Reconstruction in 1877 consisted of the removal of federal troops from the former Confederate states. So it was basically saying, we're throwing in the towel on enforcing the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. So he's sitting here, he's asking for federal troops, they're being denied. He's being asked to form a militia, and confronting this choice of whether to set up a black militia or not. And it's a heartbreaking situation. And again, I'm leaving out a lot of details, although they're not boring details, they're interesting details. At one point in here, and I'll just sort of leave this as a tease, the Attorney General, who's anti-Reconstruction, sends a friend of his to Mississippi to go live with Ames and babysit him in the governor's mansion. This is, the governor's mansion you all know, and make him make a peace treaty with the Democratic Party pre the big elections of fall 1875. So then there's a whole drama. The Clinton Massacre is early September, the date we're on now, and then this is all taking place in late September, early October. Then there's the peace treaty, then there's the election.
Tell us a little bit more as we think about kind of that peace treaty component. We know what's going to come after this is ultimately formalizing the removal of black Mississippians, of black men from the electoral process with the 1890 Constitution. But what's going into that peace treaty? You kind of lay it out well in the book, but give us a little more of who's in those conversations and why.
So the aforementioned James Zachariah George and Elbert Barksdale are the two chief Democratic negotiators. They're the leading figures in the respectable Democratic Party. And then Ames on the other side, and then this guy named George Chase, who had been sent down from New York to be the peace mediator. And basically, it's a really simple deal, which is if Ames will promise not to raise a black militia, a black local state militia, to do various things connected with guaranteeing free elections in the fall of 1875, the Democrats will agree to allow the elections to go forth fairly. Now, not to be too light about it, is anybody old enough to remember the Peanuts comic strip with Lucy and the football? So it's kind of like that, you know, because, I mean, first thing that strikes you is, well, if all these militia groups were actually, you know, completely independent bad actors who had no connection to the Democratic Party, then how come the Democratic Party could negotiate on the premise they could turn their activities on and off at will? But that was the premise. So, so they basically, that was the deal, that Ames promised not to send a militia. It was actually going to go, the specific case was going to go to Yazoo City. But they promised in return that the fall elections would be fair and this, you know, terror activity would cease. Has anybody ever seen the movie Birth of a Nation? Which, you know, we're not supposed to watch, but it's actually very useful because it tells this story quite accurately. And the climactic scene, if you've seen it, you remember, is a bunch of Ku Klux Klan guys on horses and terrorizing black people where? At a polling place to prevent them from voting. It's a political act. So I don't have to tell you what happened after the peace treaty. It's, you know, it's like Lucy pulling the football away. The free and fair elections did not happen. The militia groups were very active on election day. And, you know, Ames, I guess, kind of talked himself into the idea that this was a peace treaty that was going to be valid, but it turned out to be just a way of getting him not to raise a militia so that the white militia activity could take place. One other little thing, which is, I referred earlier to this sort of uncertainty of public opinion in the North among Republicans. So the reason George and Barksdale didn't want there to be a black militia is they felt that that delegation of people would be killed. And they didn't want them to be killed because they thought that would revive the sort of old abolitionist public opinion in the North, which had gone quiet. So, so that's why they didn't want a black militia. They didn't want to do anything to disrupt a national climate of opinion that was becoming increasingly friendly to letting them nullify the 15th Amendment.
Al, we know the year after 1875, 1876, we get a special investigative committee from the United States Senate where they're going to produce the Boutwell Report. And we're going to see things like Vicksburg and Yazoo City and Clinton in that report. Can you tell us just a little bit about what the significance of that report and why? You know, we've kind of seen and heard a little bit from this perspective of Ames and Grant, but let's go a little broader maybe to the U.S. Senate and kind of get a picture there.
Yeah, sure. So the importance of the testimonies is this. You have a number of whites giving their perspective, many of whom were involved in the massacres. I call them massacres. And then you have an equal number of blacks giving their testimony. One thing that was consistent throughout the testimonies is that you had black people saying, I'm going to tell you a part of the story. I'm not going to tell you all of the story. And the inference is once you leave and go back to Washington, we have to stay here with these folks, okay? And so you see women in particular, because they were watching as the massacre happened in front of their eyes. The men were the victims. The men and the boys were the victims in the massacre. They were the ones being shot. The women were watching what had unfolded. The men told their stories, in particular in Vicksburg and in Raymond and other places like that, Yazoo City, Natchez. They told their stories. They tried to justify why it was, they were politically active. Okay, it was to get a little slice of the pie that they absolutely deserve. And since we're talking about the 14th Amendment, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, of course, it guarantees citizenship, but it also it guarantees you equality under the law. And so when you think about enslavement, the slavery era, the antebellum period where, many blacks were enslaved, they had a bird's eye view of what luxury meant. They had a bird's eye view. They had a front seat to what good living was. And once they were freed, once they got their freedom, they believed that they deserved to live that way as well. And so that's what those men were engaging in the political system for. They wanted land, they wanted equality, they wanted upward mobility. And so you see that in the testimonies. That's in the testimonies. The women, on the other hand, they were testifying for the sake of history, right? So they knew that these testimonies were going to be used sometime in the future, maybe in the present, right, to bring some sort of justice. And so you see them being very, very brave, but you also see them using their common sense and saying, okay, because there was not only the murdering of men, there was sexual violence against women. You see a lot of breaking into homes when the men were hiding out in cane brushes and hiding out in the forest. You see women's homes being broken into, their money being stolen, and so and sexual violence happening. And so they knew what could happen when the government left and angry white men were left behind to lord over them.
DeeDee, as we kind of wrap up the last part of our report before we go to audience Q&A, this is just one of several programs that are going to happen right here this week as we commemorate the events of the Clinton Massacre. And so, one, tell us a little bit about what else is going on the rest of this week. And then I know we also have something special to kind of share with folks. And then the rest of the group, after we have that, I want us to think of just kind of one final piece of why this is important to remember, especially these events of racial violence, especially as we look back at the period of Reconstruction and as we step in the coming year to the 250th anniversary of this nation. And so, DeeDee, start with just telling us what else is going on this week.
Sure. So tomorrow is the actual anniversary, the 150th anniversary of the Clinton Massacre. In the morning at 10 o'clock, we're going to have sort of a brief little gathering at the historical marker, which is at 300 Northside Drive in Clinton. And there are some little handouts throughout the crowd with all this information on it. Senator Hillman Frazier is going to be there to talk about this Senate resolution that I'm going to tell you all about in a second. And then tomorrow night at 6 o'clock at the Entergy Theater at Mississippi College, we're going to do an academic panel on sort of the Clinton Massacre and the overthrow of multiracial democracy in Mississippi. It's going to be Professor Lemann and Dr. Jones and Dr. Dorsey, and they'll be joined by Dr. Heath Anderson from Mississippi State. And that's at 6. And then on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock at Mount Hood Missionary Baptist Church in Clinton, we're going to have sort of a memorial service for the people who were killed during the massacre. A lot of the people's descendants still attend that church today, and we'll be hearing from a couple of them, including Representative Bryant Clark is actually descended from one of the Clinton people. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room know that his father was the first African-American legislator after Reconstruction to be elected. That was 1968, something like that. Yeah, so Robert Clark and Bryant Clark were descendants of Clinton survivors. And then we're also going to have Congress at that 10 o'clock service. We're also going to have Justice Robert Gray, or is it, I'm sorry, is it James Graves? James Graves, sorry. Justice James Graves will be speaking, as well as Congressman Benny Thompson, and once again, Senator Frazier will be speaking at that service as well. So we're going to hear the descendants' testimonials, and then we'll hear from current leaders in Mississippi today.
Absolutely, and if you would like to be able to write down some of that information, you'll see them on tables around, and so we've got plenty of them on some of the tables around we can make sure to get to. But DeeDee, show us the resolution that you have.
So last year, I contacted Representative Zakiya Summers to ask if she could introduce a House resolution, or I think she was going to do it as a joint resolution to observe the 150th anniversary. And the resolution that she introduced, whoever was in charge of the committee kind of sat on it and let it die in the committee. But Senator Frazier stepped in and introduced it in the Senate. And so we have a Senate resolution that he introduced, and it commemorates the 150th anniversary of the Clinton Massacre. Thank you, Senator Frazier. He's the hero.
So before we move to audience Q&A, we'll just kind of move down the line and kind of give us one piece or one kind of leaving word as we think about the importance of commemorating, remembering these acts of racial violence as we look forward in our history in Mississippi. And so Al, we'll start with you and we'll make our way back down.
Yeah, George Santayana, a Harvard historian, who said that if we don't learn from the past, we're doomed to repeat it, essentially. History cannot be whitewashed, it cannot be erased, it cannot be forgotten. If we are going to evolve as an animal species, we must remember the past, we must historicize it as accurately as possible if we're going to grow together and finally become e pluribus unum, a nation of many people trying to be a country, right? An aggregate of many different nations trying to become one nation.
So in my studies, I've learned that the past always impinges on the present, and certainly the Clinton Massacre has been an instance of the past impinging on the present. I think that racial trauma has ripple effects, and I don't think that we need racial reconciliation. I think we need racial reckoning, so that's what I call for.
Just to sort of repeat what I had mentioned earlier, is that studying this true history of Mississippi, it's a story of triumph in the long run, and I think that's inspiring. Some people treat honest history like it's, I don't know, demoralizing or insulting America or something, but this is a story about good triumphing, so I think it's an inspiring story, to be honest.
Professor Lemann?
I would say, I started this, as I mentioned it earlier, thinking what I was writing about was one thing and finding out it was actually another thing. I thought I was writing about sort of the psychology of race and racism as a psychological phenomenon, and it is a very powerful psychological phenomenon, so I'm not denying that. But this is a political story, and politics matters, so that's what I'd like people to take away from this. This is a story of a fight about who gets to vote in the United States, and it's a little bit chicken and egg. The psychology shapes how that plays out, and then how it plays out shapes the psychology. So after Reconstruction, a lot of the country just kind of forgot that it had ever happened for 100 years. But I just want to really stress, back then, 150 years ago, and now, what happens in politics, policy, and elections is incredibly important and has a shaping effect on race relations and many other things.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have plenty of time for questions, so if you'll raise your hand, Alexis will make her way around the room with the microphone.
Yes, Mr. Lemann, I am just what you said just a second ago. Now, it seems like we're seeing a repeat of all of that now with a man in Washington saying that museums must only show positive history, and it affects elections and who gets to vote. I mean, we're sort of getting back to that of a new disenfranchisement. So, yeah, history really is repeating itself.
Well, I mean, I'm sure everybody in this room is very aware of how, you know, you're having a very dramatic, shall we say, moment in politics, and one of the things that happens is history becomes a target, and it's a target now. From what I've heard in my short time here so far, where we're sitting now has been largely spared, and I hope that continues, because the building of these museums has really been a great achievement for the state of Mississippi and for the people of Mississippi. But you just see in the Reconstruction story especially the interplay between history, how history is told, and history as a result of politics, and then history as a shaper of politics, and you know, you're seeing that pattern again now.
Thank you. I was just wondering, this massacre that we're talking about in Clinton, the massacre itself, when they have the rally, and it's out of this, at the rally and the picnic, you have violence erupting. And you have, I think, about less than a dozen people who got killed that evening at the rally and the picnic. After that, immediately after that, for the coming weeks, several dozens of black people got killed. And I'm wondering, where was the police? The black people ran away. They expect to escape the bushes, run to Jackson, they disperse to escape from the violence. But a lot of them got killed over the following immediately after the event. And I guess that is why you could really talk about a massacre, because the number of deaths that occurred immediately after the picnic itself. And I was just wondering, where were the police? What kind of protection? The black people didn't have any kind of protection at all. And Grant himself, the president, seeing this violence taking place in Mississippi, he could have changed his mind, because he did send troops to other places. Why couldn't he have decided to send troops to protect the black people, or the police, or the governor trying to do something to protect these black people that were slaughtered all over the place? Thank you.
That was the travesty for what happened here in Clinton. There were troops sent in to Vicksburg, albeit I think it was a month late, but Grant decided not to send in any federal troops to Clinton, and that was sort of the defining mark. And the South was sort of left to its own devices, but there was no reckoning. There was no justice for anyone in Clinton. There were 35 to 50 people of African descent that ended up being murdered. 3 white people on the day of the rally on September 4th who died, who were likely the ones, 2 at least, were the ones who fired the first shots. And then on the days that followed, it was the people who were the leaders of the Republican Party who were dragged from their homes and essentially lynched in front of their families, who were killed, but they were targeted because of their leadership in the Republican Party, but no one was ever prosecuted or brought to any form of justice. But there's no answer to your question. There's no justice. There was no reckoning of any sort.
And among those dozens of people who were killed in the coming weeks and months, 2 were actually some of those black legislators. Charles Caldwell was shot in Clinton on Christmas Day. And then on October 20th, this one is lesser known, but on October 20th, 1875, Representative James G. Patterson from Yazoo County was lynched in Yazoo. So 2 that we know of, maybe more, I don't know, but that we know of, 2 of the legislators were also killed in that 1875 ensuing violence.
One other really important thing, in addition to that, yes, so for weeks after, these 2 primary massacres, people were killed. They were running, they were fleeing, they were hiding in the bushes in Jackson and other places. One important thing you have to consider, again, context. 1873, huge depression, right? The country's in depression. Land value isn't worth much in the South. And so white folks are losing their land, and there's not a lot of tax money to pay a large police force or sheriff's force. And that, in context, you're looking at the Democratic Party trying to retake the government. And so if the Republicans, white Republicans, are in the minority and they live here, well, the sad part is around 1873, 1874, 1875, they become allies with the Democrats because the Democrats just have more numbers. That's the unfortunate part.
Two quick questions. One, I think to you, Dr. Dorsey, yes or no, did Peter Crosby actually walk from Vicksburg to Bovana or Flowers to get here?
No, he rode a horse. He had a horse.
My next question, I think to you, Dr. Jones, I think it was you that I first read some years ago that thought it was important to change the name from riot to massacre. And it has always amazed me. I was at Jackson State, people still call it a riot. How could you be so cruel with the violence, with celebration of the violence, the cruelty, to the point of cutting off body parts and things that we know happen, the sexual things that we know, and then you try to clean it up with the word riot? It's just a big, is there anything you could tell me to help me out with that?
That was part of the white Democratic narrative that was perpetuated literally in the days after it happened to try to cover up what had happened. In many of the ways in which they tried to keep federal forces from coming back into Mississippi to downplay what had happened, what had a lot to do with what they called it, and in trying to get ahead of the narrative. The Democratic Party put out its own campaign document number 2, where they tried to perpetuate that it was a black uprising to try to take over the town of Clinton. So they tried to use this whole stereotype of a black insurrection to try to get vengeance for slavery, right, which didn't happen 10 years after the death of slavery in 1875. That's not what happened, but they tried to use that. And they often, and I'm sure Dr. Lemann would talk about that if the time allowed, but that was often the narrative that was perpetuated in these instances of Reconstruction violence, in trying to perpetrate it back on the black population with these instances that were really white insurrections, white on black violence, that they tried to turn it around the other way.
In addition, I just want to add one really quick thing. It was in 1866 in the New Orleans Massacre. It was General Philip Sheridan who came up to Vicksburg to reinstall Peter Crosby into his office. In the 1866 New Orleans Massacre, he wrote that this was an absolute massacre. So he got the language right.
Well, my question is sort of piggyback on that one, but One of the things that I'm really fuzzy about, and you probably won't have time to answer this, is if I'm thinking of people who have been enslaved and not allowed to have very much except for minimal necessities, and then suddenly they're free, and what are they expected to go with in order to survive? And their learning has been limited, and suddenly they're expected to jump into participating in a political system. All that's very fuzzy, but my question in all of this, I'm relating it to what's happened with Black Wall Street, and one of the comparison between whether it's called a riot or a massacre had to do with how much responsibility the federal government would take in recognizing the event and helping to rebuild or reparations for what happened to the people.
So there's a lot there to unpack. To put it succinctly, I think it is a factor of exploitative capitalism, right? And so the goal is to get these people to get them to work, right? It's not about how well you can live, it's about how much of your labor can I extract it at the lowest cost.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know that there are other questions, and we have a phenomenal panel that will be happy to answer those for you. And so please, I welcome you guys to stay and ask questions. But one more time, let's give a round of applause for Albert Dorsey, Missy Jones, DeeDee Baldwin, and Nicholas Lemann. And thank you again for Senator Hillman Frazier and his sponsoring of that recognition. So thank you guys. We hope to have you again back with us next week for the Friends at Gulf Coast Vietnamese Narratives. Y'all have a great week.